This nibble originally aired on RSBANDB Update, episode 848. Pointy Sticks Be Sus. Enjoy.
Let's do it. I wrote it out in advance, so it's time for story time with Thaxy.
Buckle up, everyone.
So, on EOC release day, Melee was king thanks to Berserk. Didn't take long. Sunshine and Deathswift released also in 2013, and for the sake of argument, we'll say the combat triangle was something close to balanced at that time. A year or two later, people realized that you could 4-tick auto attack with magic by switching weapons, and that gave magic a sweaty and expensive 15% damage buff, and the magic meta began. 2016, we got Invention, which obviously wasn't a combat or style specific, but for comparison here, it gave us about a 17% damage buff for a whole spanking 120, and just keep that in mind. Next up, Telos released, and Melee got the Zaros Godsword, which was a 12.5% buff that was situational, but required you to stand still. So, not incredibly useful maybe, but a good buff. Enchanted but Criminal Bolts were released later that year, and Ranged got a 12 to 15% damage buff that basically nobody registered as super important. We all said, oh, this is a nice quality of life, I'll use these sometimes. Oh, they're expensive? Maybe not. And people just kind of glossed over it. So now it's 2018, and after wait a second. Yeah, and after buffs to Melee... Oh, no, hold on. I did miss something. Right, Melee got the ZGS, the Criminal Bolt released. Right. So 2018, we've got those two buffs to Melee and Ranged that bring that up to maybe where 4-tick auto-attacking is, and I would argue the combat triangle is nearly balanced again. People are still sleeping on Hydrix bolts, and on rubies to a lesser degree, so range is seen as a bit weaker, but magic is still used most places because of its ranged advantage over Melee. Next up, the ED2 Codex upgrades for Melee dropped with trimmed masterwork, and the Ceridome and Godbow special was reworked and buffed so that it was actually useful, while the ECB was released.
Eldritch Crossbow.
It was big... Yeah, Eldritch Crossbow, right. With these big updates to range and melee, and people realizing that Ruby Bolts are actually pretty good, magic was left behind for DPS. People are still sleeping on Hydrix Bolts. They've also used magic for nearly 4 years, and they're used to it and they know that it works, and so magic is still used at a lot of high-tier PvM. The perception is that things are pretty balanced. In reality, magic is probably a bit behind. Remainder of 2019 and 2020 are quiet until December of 2020. Greater Ricochet is released, and people realize at large that Hydrix bolts also exist. At this point, Tier 85 plus range gear all triples in price. Magic has not gotten a buff in years, really just 4-tick auto-attacking, and ranged is suddenly ridiculous. At this point, outside the highest echelons of PvMers, outside the true masters of magic, outside the masters of melee, and people that can hybrid, range does about 15 to 20% more damage than magic, and melee falls somewhere in the middle of those. It's the wildest damage range seen since EOC. We've never had something jump up that far above another style. We know that buffs are coming to magic, maybe melee, and Elder God Wars then gets announced. Carapac drops 15 to 20% DPS buffs to magic, which is... Just think about that. That's bigger than a 120 skill. It's the biggest jump since 2013 when we got the damage-boosting ultimates. The Glacior drops about a 10% buff to melee, and for the last few weeks, I would personally say the combat triangle was something close to balanced again. This is where I was hoping Elder God Wars would leave us until the next big PvM update. For a while, in other words. To let the price of gear fall back towards even between the styles. Let people use what they wanted to use. Not worry about somebody saying, hey, what are you doing? I wanted maybe some new ranged gear, but nothing best in slot, nothing big, just maybe an alternative weapon for people who are wanting to get into range to use. And that brings us to these arrows. Also, just for context, I love bows. I've used bows for a lot of solo content, just for personal preference, and I realized that without the criminals, bows are the weakest weapon choice of any style of combat outside of thrown weapons.
And I just want to interject with that I don't think I've used a bow since AOC came out.
I love them. I still use them for honestly most of my solo content, and I think they do just fine.
Like the added distance.
Yeah. Well, the Eldritch crossbow does have a 9 square range, just like a bow, but for the most part, you're right. Yeah, they're shorter. Which leads to my hottest take for the day and a TLDR for the next segments. With these arrows, I personally am very confident that bow camping will out-damage crossbow camping when using the best options for arrows and the best option for bolts. And that with switching at appropriate times between two arrows and bolts, this will be more than a 15% DPS buff to best in slot range. Potentially much, much, much higher.
So effectively what you're talking about then is doing a swamp between the high-level bow with the new arrows and crossbows with Hydrix.
Correct. And some other stuff besides, and I'll unpack all of those rotations as we go through these arrows. But it's huge, and there goes the triangle again. The range meta will continue. And I know that I'm framing this in a really harsh light. Like, I know. And maybe it's not, and truly I don't know that it's super healthy for the game. Simply from, like, I'm okay with power creep. Power creep is amazing and should be existing because it's makes
natural in an MMO.
It makes older content more accessible for more players. And I think that's awesome, right? Like, Solak on release was so challenging for everybody. Solak now, it's in the reach of a lot of players. Like, and I think that that's a good thing. I really like that. I just dislike that we've gone from getting, 5 or 10% buffs to each combat style every, 3 or 4 years to now, in the space of 2-3 years, the combat styles have all gotten, 20 to 30% buffs. And this is a huge one that I think people are like, it's just arrows, dog.
You can find full episodes of RSBANDB Update right here on this YouTube channel. If you found this video useful or just enjoyed it, like and subscribe, or leave a comment.